My name is Torres, and I want to tell you about the particular freedom that comes with being given an impossible job. When something is declared impossible, the pressure disappears. Nobody expects you to succeed. Nobody is watching with the weight of expectation on your every move. You are free to try things that would look foolish if success was expected, to fail in directions that would be embarrassing if the stakes were clear, to approach the problem from angles that everyone else dismissed as absurd, because when the job is impossible, there is no such thing as too absurd. That freedom is worth more than most people realize. The job was the Vora's Relay Network. The Vora's Relay Network was the most ambitious communications infrastructure project in Outer Belt history, a chain of 47 relay stations spanning 3-star systems that would have given every inhabited world in the zone reliable real-time communication for the first time. It had been designed by the best engineering teams in the Catherine Authority. It had been built over 8 years at enormous cost. It had been activated 18 months ago. It had never worked correctly. Not completely wrong, the partial functionality was in some ways worse than complete failure because it was good enough to be useful some of the time and unreliable enough to be dangerous when it failed at the wrong moment, which it did regularly and without apparent pattern. 3 separate teams from 3 separate organizations had investigated the network over 18 months. The Catherine Authority Technical Division, an independent engineering consortium from the Outer Belt Coalition, a specialized communications research group from the Tethian University program that had published 47 papers on relay network architecture. All 3 had reached the same conclusion. The failure pattern was consistent with a resonance interference phenomenon that occurred at the intersection of the network's 3 subsystems. But the interference was sufficiently complex and the network sufficiently large that identifying the specific source was computationally intractable with current methods. The problem was real, identifiable in its effects, and effectively unsolvable without a fundamentally different approach that none of the 3 teams had been able to define. The network was declared a functional failure. 18 months of construction and operation had been unable to fix. The Outer Belt Coalition Authority, running out of options and facing significant political pressure from the colony worlds that had been promised reliable communications, made the decision that organizations make when they are desperate enough to try anything. They gave the problem to a human team. Not because of any particular confidence in human engineering capability. The Catherine Technical Division was considerably more credentialed. Not because of any strategic preference. It was straightforwardly that every other option had been exhausted and the human outer colony technical corps had submitted a proposal that was either genuinely innovative or completely wrong, and the authority was in a position where they were willing to find out which. Our proposal was 4 pages long. The Catherine Technical Division's final report had been 940 pages. I led the team, which had 5 people and no specific credentials in relay network architecture, which was either a significant disadvantage or a significant advantage, depending on how you looked at it. My background was in field communication systems on cargo and survey vessels, practical work in difficult conditions on equipment that was not designed for the conditions it was operating in. My team had similar backgrounds. None of us had designed a relay network. All of us had fixed communication systems that were not working in places were not an option. We arrived at the Vora's Network primary hub with the 940-page report, 18 months of operational data, and the particular mindset of people who have been given an impossible job and find that liberating rather than discouraging. We spent the first 2 weeks reading. Not the report. We read the operational data. 18 months of raw performance records from all 47 relay stations, the kind of data that the 3 previous teams had used as the basis for their analysis, but which we approached differently. The 3 previous teams had been looking for the source of the interference. We were looking for when it was not there. The distinction sounds small. It was not small. The interference pattern was the thing everyone had been studying because the interference pattern was the problem. But the interference pattern was also complex and variable and had defeated 3 sophisticated analytical approaches. Complexity that defeats analysis from one direction sometimes yields from another. The other direction was the absences. There were periods in the operational data where the interference dropped significantly, not to 0, but low enough that the network performed at close to its design capacity. These periods were irregular and brief and had been noted in the previous analyses as anomalous favorable conditions that did not fit the interference model. We treated them as the most important data in the 18 months of records. We mapped every favorable period, duration, timing, network load at the time, stellar positioning of the 3 subsystem anchor stations, maintenance activities logged in the surrounding window, and every other variable we could extract from the operatio, NAL records. This took 3 weeks and produced a data set that the previous analyses had not assembled because the previous analyses had been focused on the interference, not on the absence of interference. The dataset showed something that was clear once you were looking at it and invisible if you were not. The favorable periods correlated with a specific combination of two factors that never appeared separately in the data but appeared together in every favorable period without exception. The first factor was a specific stellar positioning geometry that occurred when the three anchor stations were at a particular angular relationship to each other, which happened irregularly based on the orbital mechanics of the three-star systems. The second factor was a maintenance window at one specific relay station, number 31, which was the hub station for the junction between the network's second and third subsystems. Separately, these two factors appeared dozens of times in the data. Together, they appeared 17 times. Every single one of those 17 times corresponded to a favorable performance period. We looked at Relay Station 31's maintenance records for the relevant windows. Station 31's maintenance windows involved a routine calibration procedure on its primary synchronization array, a procedure that was standard across all 47 stations and performed regularly everywhere. What was different at Station 31 was that its synchronization array had been installed with a non-standard component, a legacy part from an earlier relay generation. Because the standard component had been back-ordered during construction and the station had been brought online with the available substitute. The substitute performed its synchronization function adequately. It also had a secondary harmonic characteristic that the standard component did not AVO. When Station 31 was in its maintenance calibration window, that secondary harmonic characteristic was momentarily suppressed. When it was suppressed and the anchor stations were in the favorable geometric relationship, the resonance interference that had defeated 3 analytical teams for 18 months simply did not occur. The interference was not coming from the intersection of the 3 subsystems. It was coming from one non-standard component in one relay station that had been installed as a temporary substitute and never replaced. We replaced it. The network came online at full design capacity 48 hours later and stayed there. The Cathiran Authority technical director was a senior officer named Vile, who had overseen the original construction in 2 of the 3 investigation teams and who came to the primary hub in person when the performance data from the full network came through. She stood in the operations room and looked at the screen showing 47 relay stations performing at design capacity simultaneously for the first time in 3 years of construction and operation. She was quiet for a long time. She said one component. I said one component. I said, Station 31, primary synchronization array, installed with a legacy substitute during construction due to supply issues. She said 3 investigation teams, she said. I said yes, I said. She said 940 pages of analysis. I said yes. She said, how did you find it? I told her about the absence mapping, the favorable periods, the 2 correlated factors, the maintenance window pattern at Station 31. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said the previous teams analyzed the interference pattern. I said yes. She said you analyzed the absence of the interference pattern. I said the interference was too complex to work from directly. The absences were simpler. Simpler problems are easier to solve. She said, why did nobody else look at the absences? I said they were anomalies in the data. Anomalies that do not fit your model are easy to set aside when the model is sophisticated enough. We did not have a sophisticated model to protect, so the anomalies were just data. She looked at me. She said, your team has no relay network credentials. I said, no. She said, your proposal was 4 pages. I said, we did not know enough to write more. She said, and you solved in 8 weeks what 3 credentialed teams could not solve in 18 months. I said, we looked at it differently. She said, how did you know to look at it differently? I said, we did not. I said, we just did not know how to look at it the same way as the previous teams, so we looked at it the way we knew how to look at things. She was quiet again. She said, I have been in technical oversight for 20 years, she said. I have seen a great many approaches to difficult problems. She said, I have never seen someone solve a problem by specifically studying when it was not there. I said, it is a field medicine approach, I said. When you cannot find the cause of a symptom directly, you study the periods when the patient is better and work backward from there. She said, field medicine. I said, my team background, I said. Most of us came from field communications on survey and cargo vessels. Field conditions teach you to find the angle that works when the standard angle does not, because in the field the standard angle does not. She looked at me for a long moment with 20 years of technical oversight behind her eyes. She said the 4-page proposal. She said. I said yes. She said page 3. She said. The methodology section. I said yes. She said page 3. She said, the methodology section. I said yes. She said it said we propose to study the network's operational successes rather than its operational failures. I said, yes. She said I read that and thought it was either the most naive approach I had seen or the most original. I said, which did you decide? She said I decided it did not matter. She said because everything else had failed and naive was worth trying. She looked back at the screens. 47 stations. Full capacity. The first time in the history of the network. She said the colony worlds. She said reliable communications as of 48 hours ago. I said yes. She said 3 years late. I said yes. She said one component. I said one component. She picked up her tablet and made a note and set it back down. She said Torres. I said yes. She said the methodology. She said studying absences rather than presences. Is it documented anywhere? I said not formally. I said it is the kind of thing you develop in the field and carry in your head. She said I would like you to write it down. She said formally. For the technical archive. I said I can do that. She said field communications approaches to complex network problems. She said there is apparently a gap in the literature. I said apparently. She almost did something that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else, but was genuine in a way that 20 years of technical oversight rarely produced in a meeting room. She said, I am glad the authority chose to try one more option. I said, so am I. She said, even if the reason was desperation. I said, especially if the reason was desperation. I said, desperation is when you run out of expected answers and start looking at unexpected ones. She looked at me one last time. She said, write the methodology. She said, make it longer than 4 pages. I said, I will try. She walked back to the operations room and I looked at the performance screens one more time and then went to find my team who were in the hub cafeteria doing what teams do in something that was supposed to be impossible. Turns out not to have been. They were drinking coffee and arguing about something unrelated and not making a big deal of it because we had not come out here to make a big deal of things. We'd come out here to fix the network. The network was fixed. I got coffee and joined the argument.